start us off with a question. This is a question primarily for Carolyn, but I'd be interested in hearing Peter's reactions as well. You focused on the issue of the language of brain-based disorders, and I absolutely appreciate the point that you're raising. I'm wondering, though, whether the problem is using language about brain-based disorders, or whether the problem is that people still have reductionistic beliefs about the meaning of that language. Because at one level, of course it's a brain disorder, just like it's also a body disorder, because those are not actually two separate ideas. And so the problem, how do we approach this so that we are not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak? Because there is something that using that language can buy us. At the same time, as a soul level of explanation, it clearly has major limitations, as you've pointed out. And so I wonder how we need to think as a field to move forward so that we can get the benefits that come with using brain-based language and yet not falling into the trap of sort of this reductionistic perspective.
I think that's a great question. And I don't know that we really have the answer at this point. So and first, I obviously agree with you. I mean, I actually have jokingly, but I'm quite serious at this point, have said, having a brain is, a necessary but not sufficient risk factor for the development of mental disorder. You have to have it. So, and I think it is really helpful for people to realize that and kind of move away from some of the stigma related to mental illness. I'm not sure that we're going to manage to reverse however many hundreds of years we've been stuck in Cartesian dualism. It'd be really nice. We know that it's not accurate. We know that that's not a useful way to think. We don't really even have language, though, in our culture that helps us break away from that terribly easily. So I guess part of my concern comes from sort of a I think, a pragmatic stance that I'm not sure we can get fully away from reductionism in people who are somewhat less educated about this. And so I think if our language lends towards reductionism, then it's problematic. On one level, I think it's going to be an empirical question. I think research in this area is really important. So can we do research about whether or not other language is more beneficial? For example, is it more beneficial to talk about biopsychosocial? Is it more useful to actually bring that language in? Or are there ways that we can develop language that, for example, a brain-based behavioral disorder, does that carry does that help us anchor in brain, but also remind people explicitly that we're still talking about behavior? And what I think has really interested me in some of this discussion and debate is how much some of the advocates of this language do not want to insert the word behavior, which says to me that there's more going on than just wanting to highlight the importance of the brain. So I would probably argue for more comprehensive language, but I think it's an empirical question whether or not that's actually going to be beneficial. In some of the preliminary studies that have been done, indeed biopsychosocial language does appear to have better outcomes in terms of people having better expectancies for treatment and those kinds of things, and they don't necessarily show much worse sort of sense of stigma. In some of the onset, though, it does not seem to offset onset stigma quite as clearly. So I think we need to wrestle with it. And I think that's really more of my point is, I agree with you, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I feel like it's a discussion that we're not having enough to really say, is this really where we optimally want to be going? And maybe there is no optimal path. Maybe I'm just being a dreamer here, but I would like to think we could do better.
I think it's very helpful with you framing the question in the way you do about reductionism. So the first thing is to recognize that this is going on. And I think it's something that Carolyn has articulated really very clearly and powerfully, and I've seen it too. I've been there day by day. This is a real problem. So seeing that it's a problem is not bad for a first start. And also it's expressed in all kinds of ways. For instance, for the first time in my career, one of my grant applications for work on the developmental psychology of autism was rejected on the grounds that any grant application, this was the English MRC, that doesn't contain either a genetic component or a brain scanning component isn't worth supporting. Okay, so there are powerful forces at work, as if you could leave out the psychological level of explanation and understanding and deliver the truth about autism, where actually, of course, I'm not disputing at all, again, that brain dysfunction is a terribly important aspect of it, but also one needs to understand the psychological story, especially in developmental perspective. So how that's going to be countered, firstly, we've got to see it's a serious problem, and secondly, keeping on emphasizing these other perspectives. You know, it's not just the, as it were, the psychodynamic side that's being squeezed out in the UK anyway, the social as well. There used to be a very strong social psychiatry movement in the UK. For me, where a lot of the battle lies is in how far you extend particular ways of seeing disorder. And so, you know, I actually do believe that recognition of syndromes, even syndromes where one doesn't really know the underpinnings, such as borderline personality disorder, have been very helpful, because one begins to examine critically what, if anything, realistically holds this group together. What do they have in common? And one can do studies on that. And indeed, autism is another case in point. And I've spent most of my professional life studying those two syndromes, because I think they are actually rather useful ways of grouping people, even though they then begin to fall apart. So it's not necessarily that you either do or you don't think these things are useful, but one thing is useful for what, and the second thing is where are the boundaries, and that's where the real battle line is to be drawn. And my point about Lear and Macbeth is that if, and I've seen this happen quite often, if one begins to look at a pattern of a human being's life from a certain perspective, from a brain perspective, from a narrow biological psychiatry perspective, one can squeeze out meaning which is terribly important. And the point is about Lear on the Heath is that here was a story of a man's redemption through becoming aware of the plight of others and what happened. And yes, it led to disorganization, breakdown, but then through to something else. And that's part of the story which must not be squeezed out.
I think you're raising a number of interesting points. I think in part this comes down to, you know, in terms of this sort of categorical versus continuous model, we are struggling as a field to decide an answer to the question of, is the whole more than the sum of its parts? And I think people really don't have a good answer to that at this point. So people will say that knowing somebody has the flu tells you something beyond they have achy joints, they're tired, they're nauseous. People are not so sure whether that's the case for mental disorders, and I think it really is a challenging question. And I think you're pointing to what are essentially trade-offs that we face. So you take something that uses the categorical approach, like the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It's incredibly useful, right? It has incredible, besides having a tradition behind it, it has enormous practical utility for defining research questions, for defining treatment, all kinds of things. But I would argue it's not very valid. So it's probably not actually a great reflection of what's going on. Then you have alternate perspectives that are being offered right now. So I'm really interested, for example, in the network perspective. Denny Boersboom and colleagues have put forward this idea that we should actually, it doesn't make sense to say you have major depression or you don't have major depression. What instead we have to look at is that people have a given set of symptoms, and the symptoms cause other symptoms. And that's where the causal connection is. And there is no sort of underlying latent entity of major depression that exists. It does a really nice job of explaining things like patterns of comorbidity, which is co-occurring disorders that are happening. And it does a really nice job of explaining why a given event has some effects for one person and different effects for another person. It's really hard to make it tractable. So when I think about writing my grant applications to say, gee, I'm going to write a grant application on these 12 causally connected symptoms that play out differently in each of the 200 participants I'm going to bring in for the study, hard to put a nice label on that one, and it's going to make it less fundable. So I think there's a real tension that we face there.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the big issues is I really do want to see that complexity as accurately portrayed, not just within our field and not just to the people who are most knowledgeable, but to all of the laypersons that are impacted by how our field operates. And I think that it's really that type of communication, you know, definitely within grants, particularly with 12-page grant applications. It's kind of hard to spend a lot of time trying to explain the basic concept that you're saying, let alone then describe your research. But really when we're talking to people about their own mental illness or the mental illness of other people, mental health and those things, that I don't think it's beneficial to kind of deliver the message in a way that makes it easier for reductionism to happen.